I told Pete asked me what was the name of my talk. It was very noisy, and he didn't hear what I said. And he said, "Oh, hormones, karma, and personality." You remember a movie some years ago called "On a Clear Day You Can See Forever" with Barbara Streisand? She was kind of a flighty girl who had some ESP powers. She couldn't quit smoking, so she went to a psychiatrist and was hypnotized. And before they knew it, they had stumbled into past life regression. And she was speaking as this former personality. And he didn't much like the flighty little girl, but he fell in love with the other personality, the earlier personality. And remember, there was an old man in the movie, a rich old man, and he was funding reincarnation research so he could figure out a way to leave his money to himself in his next incarnation. So it was fun, but there's some truth in it, too. Do you think that that same old man is going to come back to claim his money? The answer is yes and no. Because there's some elements of us that reincarnate and some that don't. We don't come back as a carbon copy of what we are in this life, but there are many elements there that are based on what we are in this life. What is it that comes back next life? What do you name something that comes back next life? Anybody? Oh, you've all read the books, you know. Besides, you've done it hundreds of times, you should remember. What's that?
Causal body.
Certain qualities. What else?
Causal body.
Causal body, okay.
Talent.
Talent. What else?
My problems.
Huh?
My problems.
Problems, okay. Problems, right. Somebody else said
Karmic
something.
imprint.
Karmic imprint, good.
Close friends.
Close friends. Uh-huh.
Desires.
Desires. Wisdom? A little wisdom. Okay. Okay. Tendencies, yeah, that's a good word. So that we know, we have studied that what's called the reincarnating ego, or the divine ego, or the soul, is fairly stable, relatively immortal, and it sends out personalities from time to time, and it is sort of the background reality behind the personalities. I think we tend to think of it as a thing, maybe like a rainbow-colored bubble that gets more beautiful colors as we evolve. But I feel more, it would be interesting to think of it as a state of consciousness rather than a thing. I think that's more the Buddhist way of thinking of the higher self or the reincarnating ego as a state of consciousness that we don't usually use much in our ordinary life and incarnation, but it's there as a potential all the time, and we can learn to tap into that. So that potential certainly survives from one life to another and does change. It's not static. It's not anything that's the same and unchanging from lifetime to lifetime. But also traces of the former personalities to survive. People call this sometimes the lower self, and as Eddie said, that's a bad term because every aspect of consciousness is important, like the keys in an octave are all important. But aspects of what we think of as temporary and transitory also can survive from lifetime to lifetime, and these are called skandhas. The Mahatma Letters and the Tibetan literature have stressed the importance of the dying moment for the future. And Stephen Levine, he was mentioned on Friday night, a picture of him flashed up. He works with the dead, with the dying very much. He tells a story about how American Indians, when they're born, they're given a special secret name for their higher self, we would say. And they learn that, and people learn that, and they sing his name to them at certain points. And they think about this name, and I would think this would invoke their higher potentials. And at the moment of death, they chant this name. So this undoubtedly helps them get into the afterlife in a beautiful way. And he was contrasting that with what's apt to happen here. You're speeding along the highway, and somebody rushes in front of you, and you're cursing at him, and then you go out. And the effect that that would have on your afterlife. So the Mahatma Letters does point out that what you think of at the last moment is not just arbitrary, that it's really from long-time habit. The influence of many years of living affects that. but it is important, so that we see that aspects of the personality do survive. And I want to read you 3 quotations, 2 from the Mahatma Letters, 1 from the Key to Theosophy, about that. Mahatma Letters. Out of the old skandhas, Trishna, or the thirst or desire for sentient life, produces the new group that forms the new being and controls the nature of the birth itself. The old being is the sole parent, father and mother at once, of the new being. And again, it is the group of skandhas that form and constitute the physical and mental individuality we call man. And in the Key to Theosophy, Blavatsky says, after death, skandhas remain as karmic effects, germs hanging in the atmosphere of the terrestrial plane, ready to come to life as so many avenging fiends. It's kind of scary, isn't it? In Buddhism, particularly, the skandhas are given a negative connotation. Jack Kornfield said that he was told by a Buddhist master that what reincarnates is our bad habits. But surely our good habits reincarnate too. If the bad habits have a force that can survive, surely the good habits do as well. But the skandhas seem to be emotional and mental patterns that are very strong in us, very powerful emotional patterns. In the Mahatma Letters, they're called shells. You know, the person dies and then the shell, which you think of as like a corpse without a consciousness inside of it, except its own very dim consciousness. It's called shells. And Blavatsky called it karmic instincts. But every action and thought and feeling, positive, negative, or neutral, leaves an imprint on the mind, a seed that can become a subconscious predisposition. And these remnants from the past are affecting us now. Challoner, who wrote, I think, a very good quest book that never was very popular called The Path of Healing, says, she calls them unruly forces, part of the personality, rebellious little lives, still powerful, separative habits, beliefs, attitudes, living forces buried in the subconscious. So it's possible to have these skandhas buried in the subconscious for many lives because they affect us, but we're not fully aware of them. They're like broken records that play over and over, and they interfere with the flow of life as it is today. They're part of what Krishnamurti called conditioning, and there are hang-ups in our hooks. These patterns are part of our present personality, and they actually take form in the inner worlds. You know, if you think a thought strongly and repeatedly, it becomes what Leadbeater called a thought form. It gets clothed in astral and mental matter. And he, you know, his book, he showed pictures of the thought forms. And Dora Kuntz's book shows pictures of patterns in the aura, in the astral aspect of the person, that become rather stable, rather than a free flow of astral matter that gets sort of caught in these eddies and whirlpools. So that these thoughts that are so powerful, they really, we get stuck in them very easily, and they continue to affect us. And they can really last a long time. They've been called elementals in the earlier literature. These are astral and mental forms that sort of become energized and take on a life of their own. So that I know if a person has some kind of a compulsion, it just goes on its own, and the personal will can't do anything about it. It's really sort of helpless in this powerful situation. Well, at death, they don't die. They last for a while. And Leadbeater talks about the permanent atoms and explains a mechanism by which these become attached to the more lasting part of the self and then become revived in the next personality. They're drawn into the new model body. And Blavatsky again calls them karmic heirlooms. And we experience them, as I said, as automatic habits and attitudes and reactions. For instance, if a person has great anxiety or goes into rage easily or is very defensive or is dominating or very submissive or impulsive, even self-confident or not, is a person who likes people, who's outgoing and friendly, or one who is more inward-turned and likes quiet more. All of these, a worrier, an optimist, being good with your hands, all of these patterns can be strong enough if we repeat them over and over and over in a lifetime to survive to the next lifetime. But they're not permanent. on Friday night when Tamara and Diana were reciting the Prajnaparamita, they talked about emptiness of skandhas, because the skandhas don't have any real inner substantive permanent life. They're a flow. It's like an eddy that gets stuck and goes round and round, so that they're not permanent. We can't overcome these habits. When we're stuck in them, it seems impossible, I know. But still, that is not anything that's going to last forever, even though it can go from one lifetime to another. And we can start to build up new habits, better habits. Taimni calls this the virtuous circle. It's hard to start a new habit. The second time you do it, it's easier. The third time you do it, it's easier, and on until it becomes automatic, so that we can set up more helpful, more useful habits deliberately when we want to. Cultures, too, have skandhas. There's a man called William Anderson wrote a book called Great Memory. And he talked about how cultures returned to the past before an innovation. For instance, they take a step backwards before they leap forwards. In the Reformation in the church, that occurred after they returned to reading the Bible in the original. And the Gothic style occurred after they stepped back into Neoplatonism, into Roman sculpture and architecture, and pre-Christian statues of mother and child. So that his proposition is that these cultures sort of carry on in a way that we might call skandhas from one to another. And we certainly see what looks like cultural conditioning in groups like in Ireland with all of these ethnic wars, and in Bosnia, these very, very deep hatreds that seem to be almost part of the racial consciousness of these people. Very, very powerful. So what does not continue into our next life? If so, these strong parts of our personality do, what does not? Well, I guess you could say the weaker tendencies, the sort of accidents that we get from our culture that aren't so deep-seated in us, maybe stopping at a red light would not be revived in the next incarnation. It's not a really deep-seated habit in us, although we repeat it very often. Our passing thoughts and temporary feelings and attitudes, our tendencies that we've overcome. These things do not get reincarnated. But the skandhas, they don't only make up what's inside of us, our disposition, but they affect what's outside of us as well. Take, for instance, Andrew Gresco. He has the distinctive title at Alcott of being the official resident baby. And everybody who looks at him lights up because he smiles and he's got this outgoing happiness about him, and he makes you feel all fuzzy and warm. So then in turn, you give him lots of affection, and he gets some good feedback from that. I remember when Carol, my daughter, was little, she was like that, and she used to get free rides at the grocery store at the checkout counter. She used to get free rides on the moving belt. So that was her immediate karma from being a happy baby. Also, if a person is frightened or is very sour or disagreeable, they're going to be lonely and isolated. They're going to attract an outer situation because of what they are inwardly. And if someone's intellectually curious, they'll undoubtedly get opportunities to learn and to study. And if someone's very compassionate, they'll have chances to help others to heal. So that what we are attracts a great deal of what happens to us from the outside. So that these skandhas are not just inward things, they also affect our lives and our events in our lives. Roger Woolger is a Jungian psychologist who studied a lot of Eastern philosophy. And he talks about what he calls psychic scars. These are negative tendencies that are carried over from one life to another, complexes. They're traces of very deep habits from the past, maybe from a trauma or some very frightening situation. He calls them vasanas. That's a Sanskrit word. It means to cling as fragrance to cloth. It's based on the idea of clinging as fragrance clings to a cloth. And these are dispositions and tendencies that he feels people are born with. He sees these in his patients, which he feels go back farther than their birth in this incarnation. Zimmer called them furrows in the psyche, and they've been called samskaras and kleshas in the Eastern literature. And if you've studied the pictures of the auras in Dora Kuntz's book, you see scars in some of them. It's sort of like the material, rather than flowing freely, gets almost crystallized in this little swirling thing that doesn't flow with the rest of the aura. So it's an actual sort of superphysical reality. The consciousness takes on astral and mental matter. And these conditions of consciousness become reflected in the aura in that way. But these things are really basically to be occur in consciousness. But as I said, these bad tendencies can be overcome. Taimni, in particular, in the science of yoga, writes a lot about attenuating the kleshas. And he thinks that we can see these scars and these wounds and these past aspects of ourselves that aren't growing with us into the future through awareness, becoming aware of them, through the intention to overcome them, and through reframing. That isn't his word, that's a more recent word. But through reframing the situation, so that instead of looking at the same thing like feeling a victim over and over again, looking at it in a broader framework and seeing it perhaps as one has some input into being a victim, and perhaps also there's something to be learned from that situation, so changing the attitude towards what is these chronic problem. Wiltshire gives an interesting example. He gives the example of Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. Scrooge, as you know, was a very mean and stingy old man, and he didn't care what happened to anybody, and he was not the least bit generous or helpful. So he has these three visions of his past and his present and his probable future. And suddenly he sees himself as he is. He has this transforming experience. And suddenly he becomes generous and joyful and helpful and does all these wonderful things for people, has this sudden about-face in his character from this insight. So that's a way that Wiltshire says Scrooge overcame some of his negative skandhas. So usually we don't have a big insight like that. I guess we do once in a while. But seldom do we have a complete transformation like that. But there are more gradual ways to work with the skandhas. I heard John Algeo say at one time that we're born with temperament and we build character. Leadbeater says, we make our own character for the future by our thinking. And the voice of the silence, talking about attaining nirvana, it says, and if he falls even then, when he's near nirvana, he does not fall in vain. The enemies he slew in the last battle will not return to life in the next birth that will be his. So that's encouraging. If we get over something in this life, we won't have to do it again next life. So that gives us some encouragement. It has partly to do with what we identify with. So many people think, I'm like this and that's me and I can't change. Like I'm stubborn, that's my nature. I was born stubborn, I've always been stubborn, I have to be stubborn, that's me. And they identify with that quality of stubbornness, for example. But that's not really what one is. One is a flow. And we get set in certain tendencies, but that's not in concrete. It can be changed, it can be loosened up. The flow can be encouraged to come again. So that part of getting rid of the negative tendencies is not identifying with them, to realize that's not our basic self. We're something other than that. That's not basically us. Christopher Chappell, he's a professor at Loyola in California, wrote a book called Karma and Creativity. And he talks about karmic purification. I like that word, karmic purification. And he says that detachment is the key, not to be attached to this sense of self, of who we are right now, to realize that it's passing, and getting into kind of a witnessing mode that Krishnamurti harps on so much, being aware, choiceless awareness. Just see these tendencies within us as they arise, and not feel, oh, that's horrible, I'm a terrible person, I feel so guilty. Just watch them in a very dispassionate way, and that loosens up our attachment to them, our hold on them, and they gradually become more flowing so that they tend to pass. We no longer identify with them. And he has another phrase that I liked a lot. He says, get outside of self-driven behavior. Get outside of self-driven behavior. And begin to see oneself as part of the whole, not just our own concerns are important, but we are in this web, interconnected web with everything that is. And we can flow with that whole rather than being stuck in our own particular concerns and self-centered activities. I wish somebody would tell Congress that. He talks about restructuring our motives, but still act, like the Gita says. Act from a different motive, but continue to act. As Eddie was saying this morning, it's the nature of things that we should act, but without concern for the fruit of the action for ourselves. And this leads to creative action, according to Chappell. We become free of the samskaras and free of personal karma. And that struck me, because I've read theosophical literature for a long time, and I know that it says somewhere near the end, you become free from karma. The masters are free from personal karma. So I assumed one day we would all get there. But it never occurred to me that I could do something about it right now, that I could start the process in the moment that's going to lead to this real freedom from personal karma. Well, we're going to change. Life is going to change us, maybe through difficulty and pain, or we can change ourselves deliberately. We can work on ourselves and try to improve ourselves. We're the result of our past, but we're creating our future selves. And even these powerful habits in time can be transformed. The Buddha said, what you are is what you have been, and what you will be is what you do now. And Jim Bugenthal, who's a therapist, a transpersonal psychologist, he said, we tend to mistake a description of who we have been for a prescription of who we can be. I think that was a very good addendum to the Buddha's statement. And of course, that's the goal of yoga and meditation and the spiritual life, eventually of life itself, so that we will change. It's not so important that we have certain characteristics, and we don't have to know the history of them. Woolger does past life regression, but Chappell thinks that's not necessary. We don't have to see the exact causes for the scars and hurts that are in us now. We don't have to go back and relive our childhood abuses and all of that. It's enough to work with the tendencies that are in us now and understand those and get those flowing again. There are many methods to help drop our hooks. Even in pop psychology, there's a lot of talk about let go and live in the now and live in the moment. And really, if one does live fully in the moment, you just do let go of these hooks and these things from the past. It just happens. So that cultivating full awareness in the moment will help to clear out the skandhas and help toward this karmic purification. The skandhas, as they're taught in Buddhism, are a little hard to line up with the theosophical principles, although not all of them are. The first one is called rupa, and that means, of course, form or body. And I compiled all the descriptions of each of the skandhas from the key to Theosophy and the Mahatma Letters and Zimmer's Philosophy of India and Govinda's Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism. So I won't bore you with all these lists, but I'll try to give you, as I understand it, which may be very imperfect, the flavor of what each of the skandhas is. A rupa, they talk about form and body, physical phenomena, material qualities, and sense contact. That's not hard. We know that corresponds to the physical body in the theosophical system. Vedana, they say sensation, sense perception, feelings from senses and emotion, pleasure, pain, joy, sorrow. What does that one remind you of? What of the human principles does that sound like? The astral. Kama, as Blavatsky called it. Right. The next one is called Sandhya. This one's hard for me to fit in because it says abstract ideas, notions of self-conscious intellection. And as I'll point out a little later, all these skandhas are what we call the lower self or the personality. They're not of Atma Buddha Manas. I'll give you some quotations later that show that. But abstract ideas you think of as being part of the higher mind, or the manas part of Atma Buddhi Manas. So I haven't quite reconciled that one in myself yet. I'm still working on that. Maybe you have some ideas. The next one is called Samskara, physical and mental tendencies, predispositions, inclinations, mental formations, tendencies of will, volition, and character. So this is sort of a grab bag of things that might be pertinent to the mental and emotional aspect of the self. And then Vijnana is coordination of the previous functions, consciousness, mental, physical, and moral predispositions, discriminating knowledge, full awareness. So this tends to be an overall consciousness, but it's obviously based on senses. It's not universal consciousness. It's not nirvanic consciousness. It's consciousness based on sense perceptions. So that those five skandhas relate to what we call the personality, the lower self, the transient part, the more transient part, although all of it's transient, the more transient part of the human consciousness and the human makeup. So these, as Eddie pointed out very, very strongly today, what we are, what we believe, affects what we actually perceive. And our reactions very strongly color all of our experience. So that all of these individual development of skandhas in each of us plays into what we see what we actually perceive. Our inner tendencies affect this process. Now, Govinda describes the skandhas in terms of consciousness. As I said, we think of an aura and a thing, and maybe a big bubble that's the higher self from Theosophical literature. But he talks about it in terms of consciousness. And he says these are 5 phases which occur in every complete process of consciousness. And he says it's impossible to separate the one from the other. They all happen almost simultaneously and together. So I have an example that I'm sure must be very oversimplified. But this would be perception. First of all, rupa, like you contact an object with the senses, say a tree. And then vedana, this is sensations, feelings, physical and emotions. You notice that the tree is green and that it has pearly bark and that it's smooth and that there's coolness and there's an aroma. And it creates, through this skandha, you create a perception. You bring all of these diverse sensations together to make a perception of one tree rather than something you smell and something you see that are not connected. So that it blends all the discrete sense impressions. And then sajna is a concept of the tree. Say it's a gum tree or a eucalyptus. We don't have a pure sense experience. So immediately this concept clamps in on these perceptions and says eucalyptus tree. We don't just see the bare, pure sensation at all. We put our concept on it. Do a little experiment right now. Look down at yourself as you're sitting there. What do you see? You see your chest. You see your knees. You might see part of your arms. You might see some legs and feet, depending on the position you're sitting on. So that's your pure perception of what you see. Do you have a head? You really don't know that you have a head from pure sense perception because you can't see it. You've never seen it. Maybe in the mirror, but that's not your head. That's a reflection. You've never seen the back of your neck. So that through pure sense perception, there are a lot of gaps that we don't know. But our concepts immediately jump in and fill in the gaps and say, yeah, there's a head there. I know I've got a head. I can see it on other people and so forth. So our concepts tell us that we've got a head. So that's just a little illustration of how we don't experience pure sense perception. Georgia O'Keeffe did some paintings like that. Like she would paint water running over rocks, but she wouldn't make it look like water and she wouldn't make it look like rocks. It was just some colors and some space and some movement in paint. And that was sort of a pure perception before we've clamped the concept of rocks and water onto it. And this is part of Zen training, to get back to this conceptless, pure perception of things, and to realize how strongly our conditioning comes in and how quickly it comes in. So that's Sanja, the concept of the tree, and it's a eucalyptus tree. And then comes Sanskara, and this evokes mental predispositions and volitions. For instance, maybe we love trees, and we want to hug the tree. We might hug the tree, or we might plant trees, or like to sit under a tree. We might think of it as part of the environment. Zella Balch, who many of you know, she was head of the bookstore here and is now at Crotona. She lived in a house in Crotona that had lots of these eucalyptus trees, and they're really messy. They shed leaves, but they also shed their bark, and they don't have a season. It keeps going on all year round. And she hates eucalyptus trees. She couldn't keep her yard clean. She wanted us to send them all back to Australia. So that's part of her reaction to the tree. And then Vijnana is a coordination of all the above. It's full awareness of the tree. All the sense modes, all the feelings, the meaning of the tree, the associations, an overview of the tree is this Vijnana, which, as I said, is clearly based on sense experience. It's not seeing the tree as part of the one life. It's reacting through our senses to this particular tree. The Mahatma Letters says, the skandhas are the elements of limited existence. And again, it says, the material-psychological attributes and sensations of the 5 lower skandhas, skandhas we've just been talking about, are not related to the purely spiritual perceptions, emotions, and feelings of the 6th principle, buddhi. So that all of this kind of inner cogitation I just described is not concerned with the higher self, with buddhi, with the spiritual awareness. It's an amalgamation of sense experience. And it's focused in the psychophysical mechanism, that is, in the senses in the body. So the skandhas, these 5 skandhas, are part of the personality. But the Mahatma Letters goes on to say that there are 5 exoteric skandhas, these, and there are 2 esoteric skandhas. So that comes as a surprise. The 2 esoteric skandhas are heresy of illusion of individuality and doctrine of self. Now think about what that means.
Say those again.
Heresy of illusion of individuality and doctrine of self. That implies that for I don't know how many lifetimes we've had this habit of thinking ourselves as separate, as a separate being. You might use the word ego, a separate focus of consciousness. It's not just something we learned in this lifetime, but it's this skandha that's been with us over and over and over again, extremely difficult to overcome, and has these separative tendencies. In the quotation I read earlier, these little lives, separative tendencies that are so hard to clear out, even though mentally we agree that there is one life, and it inspires us, and we want to be loving and kind and compassionate and live it out in our lives. We still have these deep-seated habits that get in the way. And it's very hard to clean those out. If you've ever tried, you probably realize. It's sort of extraordinary that we divide everything in the universe into 2 categories, me and not me. Think of that. There's me and there's everything else. There's self and there's not self. And that's a very deep mental tendency that we have. But fortunately, it's not our only mode of consciousness. We can learn to soften our boundaries. We can set up new habits. We can develop Buddhic consciousness, empathy and compassion, blending with others and with nature. All of this we can deliberately encourage within ourselves if we want to. Buddhism, of course, has another name for universal consciousness. Govinda calls it depth consciousness. And Father Bede had the most, I think, eloquent, simple, elegant, short quotation that gives the idea of the whole evolution of consciousness from the theosophical point of view, just summed up in a couple of sentences. He says, we are slowly recovering the knowledge which was universal in the ancient world, that there is no such thing as matter apart from mind or consciousness. Remember that from the Secret Doctrine, consciousness and matter are both emerged from the one, and everything in the world is alive. Consciousness is latent in every particle of matter, and the mathematical order which science discovers in the universe is due to the working of the universal consciousness in it, divine mind, Mahat, Logos, universal order, divine mind. In human nature, this latent consciousness begins to come into actual consciousness. we get focused. Our consciousness becomes intense and focused in the human organism. And as human consciousness develops, it grows more and more conscious of the universal consciousness in which it is grounded. I think that's just a very complete statement of what happens. There is this sort of dim awareness in everything, becomes focused and intense in human beings like a lens intensifies of the sun's rays, and then out from that aware again of the universal consciousness everywhere and everything. So that we have that potential in us to realize that universal consciousness. The Buddha called it turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness, so that we're no longer focused within the skandhas, the 5 lower skandhas, but we somehow are able to break through that and feel the unity that's beyond. Joy Mills said that the secret doctrine is really for this purpose. She didn't see it as to learn about rounds and races and all of that sort of thing. She saw it as a way for us to come to have an understanding and appreciation of this one life that's behind everything, this one universal consciousness. Radha Burnya, in her book Human Regeneration, says, we have created divisions in our thinking and need a totally new mind, a mind without divisions, distinctions, comparisons, and evaluations. I think we don't realize how much we judge each other and how much we maybe don't appreciate the good qualities in someone because they have some qualities we don't really like too much or don't approve of. Don't really see people as they are, but see them through judgmental attitudes. Radha again says, we need a fundamental change from selfishness to unity. And B. Wood, who's octogenarian, no, she's a centenarian. I guess she's 102 now. She's a world-famous sculptress. She lives in Ojai, and she's a theosophist and has been since she's a very young woman. And she puts things in a very down-to-earth way, a very simple way. And she said that we need to meet each other without walls. And Swami Byandananda, who Eddie quoted earlier, you know who he is. He's a fictitious, very wise man with a great sense of humor. And somebody asked Swami, what's the fastest way to enlightenment? And Swami says, ego, egoing, egone. So the point is to get beyond this sense of separation that is so deep-seated in us and to become aware of it at ever deeper levels and reframe it and have the intention of trying to let it go and work with it so that we can really grow into our potential of freedom and unity with all.